Building an interactive system for a game is not only an obviously necessary step for implementing sound, but also an occasion to be creative with sound design and think about optimization of resources. I built a little system in Wwise that we're going to look at to explore some of the solutions and the opportunities that Wwise offers in this sense. Specifically, I'm going to have a look at using procedural synthesis, impactor, and then we'll explore an alternative to having random containers with lots of sounds. Procedural synthesis is a technique that relies on generating sounds in real time based on game states rather than playing back pre-recorded sounds. It comes with challenges and limitations, but it can be amazing for interactive applications. In my system, I've used Synth1, which is Wwise built-in synthesizer, to create ever-evolving layers of wind to be added to my background. I started by setting up a rather simple background using layer pre-recorded loops that crossfade depending on the RTCP weather quality. I then added two different rain intensities that are active at different levels of the weather quality RTCP. Using these loops as the foundation for my background, I then use synthesis to create a controllable wind layer. The first layer uses pink noise coming from Synth1, which I process through a resonant low-pass filter whose cutoff frequency is being modulated by a sine LFO. I try to set start and target frequencies to values that made sense by ear. This is okay, but the rhythmic, repetitive, cyclical nature of the LFO makes it sound very unnatural. To fix this, I added a second modulator that changes dynamically the LFO period. And obviously I could set any of these parameters to be controlled by game states. That's what's so cool about procedural synthesis. For the window, I really wanted something that would evolve and change by itself in the background. To add even more variety and explore a slightly different technique, I've also added a second layer of wind that allows me to play back controlled and randomized gusts of wind. This layer uses bandpass pink noise, and its center frequency is modulated by an envelope. The cool thing about using envelopes is that all values can be easily randomized without using external modulators, so every time I play back the event, the gust sounds slightly different. The challenge at this point was to find a way to continuously re-trigger the envelope without relying on in-game parameters. Here's my solution. Maybe there's a better one. I've used the interactive music hierarchy to host a dummy MIDI trigger that controls Synth1, and I've added the music segment that contains the MIDI trigger to a music playlist container set to random continuous together with an empty event. This way the playlist keeps running, triggering only occasionally the gust of wind. If I wanted, I could even use the weight control to bias the probability of how often the gust of wind gets triggered. This layer is really meant to be auditioned together with the other procedural wind. Here it is. And mixed with the rest of the bad weather elements, I think the result is quite realistic. I think now we need some thunderclaps. While I could obviously load a random containers with a bunch of sound effects of single thunderclaps, I thought it would be fun to try and use Wwise on Impactor, which I believe is still in beta. Impactor essentially allows you to drag and drop a bunch of impact sounds into a pool, analyze those and repurpose and vary them using cross-synthesis. I have only two sound effects. For each one, Impactor is using both the impact and the body part and randomly combining them into new sounds at every play event. I set this to loop infinite. An alternative would be to add this to a random container, set play mode to continuous, and set transition to delay, which I could then modulate or randomize to get something similar to the scatterer instrument in FMod Studio. I could also modify and hook up to game states the different parameters that are available for the newly synthesized sounds. Mass and velocity, for example, are two that can really change the nature of your sound, and you can obviously also randomize them. While my experience is that Impactor works best with a very specific type of sound, typically something short and very metallic sounding, it still is a very interesting solution to explore when you have only a very limited amount of samples to work with and you don't want to rely on pitch randomization. I have another example using Impactor with footsteps, and this time we're going to compare it directly with a more traditional workflow using random containers. I set up switches for two types of surface, grass and wood, and I have two random containers with 5 footstep samples each. Here is how they sound in the Soundcaster. Now I have the exact same sounds loaded into two different instances of Impactor. Here's the grass, for example. Note how it's matching impact and body from different samples on each event, and I can then tweak mass and velocity. Let's compare the footsteps created with the two different techniques. They both sound okay, but especially on the grass footsteps, I feel Impactor sounds a little more natural. Finally, I want to show you a technique which I use occasionally that I think can yield to very interesting results, especially if well integrated into the game's physics. Let's use some simple character cloth foley as an example. Let's say that I have to design 3 different types of foley movement for my character. Let's say short, medium and long to match different character movements. A typical approach to this, which would probably work very well, would be to record a bunch of variations of these sounds and then host them into random containers. Here's a different and more resource efficient solution that we can try. I have a long continuous recording of cloth rubbing. It could be much shorter than this. I loaded this in Wwise and modulated the voice volume via an envelope. I then created a play event for this sound effect, immediately followed by a seek action. I set seek% to 50 and used the randomizer. Now at each play event, Wwise is starting the sample at a slightly different spot, providing a lot of variation. I can then duplicate the same sound effect twice and tweak the envelopes for short, medium and long foley. I then set up switches for those so that we can audition them in the Soundcaster, and you'll see that I have quite a lot of variation in 3 flavors without even touching pitch or EQ. These are obviously just 3 examples. The potential for procedural audio and real-time processing is very high. I didn't even mention grain, which is Wwise integrated granular synthesizer or any third-party app, and there are a lot of them. I hope this was somewhat useful. I thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time.